Good evening. Good to have you with us in the 9th edition of the Urban Debate. Viewers, our politicians, while they are seeking our vote, make a lot of promises to us. Via their speeches, in their door-to-door campaigning, via their manifestos. But it's now part of the whole deal that everybody knows barely a percentage of those promises are ever fulfilled. Yet the system continues. The other aspect is when they do come to power, where governments are formed and governments make announcements. Those announcements could be specific schemes meant to bring in relief for specific segments of people or everybody. Those announcements can also be promises of what they're going to change, policies that they will bring. Those announcements can be assurances of how the government is going to provide you support in difficult times. One such assurance by Chief Minister Kejriwal has now become a very interesting legal battle and has brought a very interesting order from the Delhi High Court. And that is what we're going to talk about. The Delhi High Court, while hearing this specific petition, said that assurance from a chief minister is an enforceable one. That good governance requires that promises that have been made to citizens are not broken. And so the court told the Delhi government on a specific promise that was made by Arvind Kejriwal as Delhi Chief Minister that take a decision on this now within 6 weeks. And once the decision is taken, then frame a clear policy in that regard. Now, so the Delhi government has 6 weeks now to act upon it. But what is this? What is it that Arvind Kejriwal had promised that somebody became so grieved that they went to court for that promise not being fulfilled? That was my first reaction and that's what I wanted to know. Basically, the Delhi Chief Minister, in the middle of the pandemic, last year when the pandemic had just hit us, he requested the landlords in Delhi to give relief to the tenants and said, don't collect rent right now. The pandemic has hit us, there is a lockdown, people are losing jobs. And so he went on to say that postpone your collection if your tenants are poor. And then he went a step further and he said that the government will compensate if the tenants are not able to pay for any specific reason later on. So even if later they're not able to pay for valid financial reasons, then we will step in and we will pay you. This was his assurance given to the landlords, while he pleaded them to not harass the tenants. Somebody has now taken this and gone to the court and said, well, the Chief Minister told us this and now he must keep up his end of the promise and he should pay us for the rent that our tenants have not paid up. Which is where the court observed that, well, promises made by a government or a chief minister are enforceable. The Delhi government must consider this case within the next 6 weeks and come back and tell us. Now imagine if that had to happen and if this becomes a precedent across the country. Imagine if we could legally hold our governments, state governments and centre accountable for the assurances and the promises that they make us. Leave the assurances and the promises. Even the schemes that they announce, which is a legitimate thing, which has been notified by them, but doesn't work on ground. Can we then go to court? Imagine if somebody now goes to court and says, well, the government promised us that everybody in this country will be vaccinated by the end of this year. That hasn't happened. It's 1st of January and I haven't gotten a vaccine. This government should be held accountable for that. I'm going to give you some more examples, but let's bring in some views and understand if this is a good way to move forward, to be able to make your ministers and governments legally accountable for the promises that they make to you when they are in power. I say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now on this conversation. Nigat Abbas of the BJP, Syed Asad Abbas, political analyst, Mr. Kailash Vasudev, Senior Advocate with the Supreme Court, and Mr. R.M.R. Sundaram, Senior Advocate with the Supreme Court. Mr. Sundaram, let's start off with you. It's a great idea on one hand, but is it a practical one?
Well, I'd say hats off to Justice Pratibha Singh for having really bearded the lion in its den, if I can use that expression. The fact is that we have got too used and take too much for granted the fact that hollow promises are made by politicians. Hollow promises are made by governments. The manifestos are only written never to be followed by any party. And thereafter, we have to go through whatever is there, and then it depends on the next election whether we like the government or not. More important than that, there are sometimes assurances made by a government itself when it's in office. Now, frankly, the legality of this order can always be questioned. There is some doubt. Number one, to ask the government to consider it is one thing, but the subsequent directions seem to be taking for granted that the government would consider it, form a policy and take care of it. So therefore, that will come up for a bit of legal debate. But actually, what the judge has based it on is a very, very strong point of law. As to whether it's made out in this case, we cannot say. And that is a case of legitimate expectation. If something is assured to me by the government, or at least by somebody in the government, I should reasonably believe has the authority and is making that assurance with the authority. And I act on that assurance. And I alter my position to a place where I'm handicapped if that assurance is not kept up. I do something by which I have given up, or I have lost money, or I have done some act. Then the principle of what is known as promissory estoppel comes in, and you can proceed against the government. Now, this case is unique because till now, where we have had promissory estoppel is when the government announces a policy and then withdraws the policy. So you say, look here, on your policy, I did act. These are the actions I did. This is the money I expended. This is all that I did. Ergo, you have to apply that policy to me. That is where we have seen it applied legally till now. Now we have a completely new sphere where a chief minister makes an assurance and a person says, look here, you made an assurance, I acted on the assurance. The government's reply is, it was just a hollow assurance because after all, it was not a policy declared in accordance with the rules of business. It was not a decision of government according to the constitution. It was just an assurance made by the chief minister. But if that person can say, look here, why should I not take it that the chief minister was making an assurance on behalf of his government, and maybe I did not look into the red tape as to whether or not the rules of business had been followed, whether the constitution had been followed, but I believed that this chief minister told me something which is correct, and I acted on it, and I can prove to the court that I've actually lost money, expended energy, and done something on it. Well, according to me, it is a question which certainly can be argued how it will be decided, applying the principle that, look here, it's not a government policy as per the rules of business. It's not a decision as per constitution. Well, a court could always say that. But I think what Justice Singh has done is she's really, stirred the hornet's nest, so to speak, and got everybody concerned with this. And in effect, what she has done is, while saying please consider it, she has also in effect directed them to form a policy. So I'd be very interested to know how the government is going to react to it and what is going to follow. I'd be very interested to see that.
Yes, so am I. Mr. Kailash Vyasdev, are you also interested to see how the government now responds to this? Because this could otherwise, open a can of worms for our governments and sitting ministers otherwise.
Evening. You see, this is a very interesting case because for the first time, you're trying to catch a dog by the tail. And it's panning out in very peculiar directions because you see, look at the overall perspective. Elections take place on false promises. Tragedy takes place. The government said that we will give you so much extra share payment. Widows run around for payments. You have the situation of sports we will give you this kind of an award and we will give you these benefits. That is also not carried out. So you see what is happening is for a change now, this gentleman has gone to court. And we'd love to see what happens in court because it's a very interesting challenge in a democracy where everybody is now playing games for the purposes of the hustings without realizing what they're saying. And if they realize what they say, I think they should be liable. Promissory estoppel, as Ariyama pointed out, legitimate expectation, as he pointed out, are basic principles of law. But on the constitutional front, when a chief minister of a state or a person in authority having the authority to make a statement on behalf of the government is concerned, he must be held accountable for that statement. We have had enough. Let me give you a very peculiar situation. In 2013, a writ petition was filed in which people said the party manifestos should be read in a manner that the party which comes into power is accountable. Supreme Court judges Satasivam and Gogoi, both who went on, one went on to become a governor, the other went on to become a Rajya Sabha MP. They gave directions to the Election Commission that, look, you will now frame guidelines. Election Commission chose not to follow the guidelines in the manner in which the contemplation of law is. Supreme Court says an election promise does not come within the purview of a corrupt practice because it is a statement by a political party, it is not a statement by an individual politician. Let's test that. Supposing an individual independent MLA was to say this, what would be his position? And what would happen if the gentleman who made the statement on the assurance of his party did not meet it? Because he's making it as a public declaration, you will get this. When he gets elected, he chooses not to implement it. He has forgotten what he had promised. So you see, it's a dichotomy which is now taking place. Election manifestos, Supreme Court says, Election Commission will frame guidelines. Election Commission says, I'll frame guidelines, but I can't implement them. Here is a person in authority after coming into power when an assurance is made. I just mentioned to you, ex gratia payments, injuries, deaths, security personnel, sports medals, floods. I'm not aware of very many states which have paid the monies which are short, which were held out. So therefore, I think this particular proceedings will be a very unique proceeding in the democratic system of India. And for a change, I hope we can come to a situation where these people who make statements are held accountable. I think Ariyama would like to argue this.
No, I would love to.
Yes.
I would love to.
I'll join you, Ariyama.
Okay, I can see the excitement that the two legal minds have, tonight on this panel for this specific topic, and I can understand that. But let me bring in the other side, and let me ask Nighat Abbas this question before I go to Syed Asad. Nighat, where do we start off with? Do we start off with government schemes that are announced, not implemented? Do we simply keep it to promises that sitting chief ministers and their deputies in a cabinet make to people but don't follow up ever on? Or do we also take it a step beyond that with the election promises that you all make and forget about after the election results?
Tanvi, to be very honest, obviously every political party makes a statement, they make their manifestos, the government makes their policies, and that has to be implemented, if not today, tomorrow. But what the Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal did last year, he did a very conscious press conference and he made a statement which literally acted like a balm to a lot of wounds of a lot of people. That he's going to pay the rent. It was a wound heal for the people who are the tenants and also for the landlords. And again, what he does, he pulls up the expectations to the highest of the level and he literally smashes it down. And the irony is that the lawyer who was representing the Delhi government in the High Court, I want to say that statement, the doctrine of legitimate expectations can only be based on actual government policy and not a political statement. So what do you want to say? Do you really want to say that you are holding a press conference, you're calling the entire media, making a statement, promising something to the people of Delhi? You yourself are called the Delhi ka beta, and you say that I am going to pay the rent for the people, so the landlords need not worry, the tenants need not worry. And then Your so-called lawyer, a very senior advocate, goes to the court and says that this was a political statement. So from now onwards, we need not trust. We are not supposed to trust the Delhi chief minister at all, because this is not for the first time. He has been making false promises since day one of his governance. Look at the roads in Delhi in monsoon. You see, and again he comes up with the statement that he's going to make the world class drainage system. Day before yesterday, he stated that. Good morning, sir. What were you doing since 7 years? You couldn't make any drainage system. This is for the first time. Delhi is facing monsoon crisis. What about the vaccination? What about the remdesivir injections? What about the drugs which were needed? What about the medications which were needed for COVID-19? He was all over the place. He has literally miserably failed, and yet again he has made the false promise. Now the question is, sadly, there's no panelist from Aam Aadmi Party. Otherwise, he should have answered. He or she should have answered, because we literally need, the Delhi people literally need that. What is going to happen to the people who are supposed to pay the rent but were not able because they lost their jobs, maybe because they had some economic issues in the COVID-19,
Fair
which was
point.
very
No,
much
Nikat, the points
obvious.
that you're making about the promise made for over a very important issue and a promise forgotten is a fair point. But I'm just asking you, I hope when you're making this argument, you are keeping in mind that this won't just be limited to then Delhi. The conversation we are having tonight is what the High Court has observed.
Of course, Tanvi. Of course,
That our
Tanvi, which
governments
is why
need
I'm
to
saying
be,
the promises.
if they're making promises, they
Exactly.
need to. So let me tell you this. Then let me just bring
There
out
are
a
lots of
fact to you.
promises. Tanvi,
More than a
last 10
quarter,
seconds.
more than 1 minute.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
More than a quarter, 28.6% of all assurances given during the 16th Lok Sabha were pending till the end of the term, as compared to 6% of assurances given in 2009 to 2014. In all, the BJP-led government made 5,383 assurances, of which 1,540 were pending during the first term.
Absolutely.
Nearly 76% of the promises made in Lok Sabha in 2018-2019 in the parliamentary sessions leading up to the 2019 general election were unfulfilled. This is data available publicly about the promises made by the central government and promises unfulfilled. Now, what should you say?
Tanvi, obviously, that's exactly what I started saying initially, that when the promises are made by the government to the people of the country or state or anywhere, it is obviously that we need to fulfill the promise, but it takes its own course of time and its protocol. This system, that's an organized system which needs to be put in. Everything has to be put together. Obviously, there has been a pandemic since 2 years, so things have got slowed down. Things have gotten slowed down. But this, what am I saying right now? I'm not saying any government policy of Arvind Kejriwal hai, like a lot of numbers of promises which are being unfulfilled by the Delhi CM. But what am I saying right now is, last year when he had stated this statement, it was something which was to be given quickly. You cannot say that I am going to pay the rent, the Delhi government is going to pay the rent, and then forget for next 1 year. That's exactly what I'm saying. If you promise something for that moment of time, you need to fulfill that.
Point taken.
The government
Now,
policy takes
none of
its
the
own
Aam
time,
Aadmi
I
Party
understand.
representatives were available for this conversation, or that's what we were told. But I do have Asad Abbas with me. And Syed, the Aam Aadmi Party came to power on the promise of being different. And if you're going to resort to the same tactics of making promises and forgetting them because, well, that is part of life and it's so taken for granted these days, any which ways in our country, then what's the point? And how are you different? And how is Arvind Kejriwal different?
Firstly, thank you very much, Tanvi, for having me on this debate. It's an absolutely spectacular to listen to two legal such as Mr. Vasudev and Mr. Sundaram, and of course, you and Nigat as well. First, now coming straight to the point, I speak as a citizen of this country, and let me tell you, Justice Pratibha Singh ji, I doff my hat at you. This is indeed a landmark judgment to me. Every chief minister, government, or any politician coming through with their manifestos or their promises must and should be an enforceable one. There are no two ways about it. Also, as a matter of fact, let me tell you, when it comes to Arvind Kejriwal ji and the Aam Aadmi Party, the government in Delhi, this is one Chief Minister, Tanvi ji, that we speak about. He's created a revolution when it comes to Bijli, Pani, especially the water, electricity, and made a significant difference when it comes to the government schools. Also, as a matter of fact, with all the might of the Bharatiya Janata Party, if the Delhi people, it is always believed that Dil Walon Ki Delhi, I believe no, it is not only Dil Walon Ki Delhi, along with Dil Walon Ki Delhi, it is Dimag Walon Ki Delhi, because they have voted this man time and again, along with all the might and right of the BJP coming through. Now, when it comes to the manifestos, let me tell you, I agree with you, Tanviji, completely. Every single politician out there, government, sitting state head must and should keep every single promise. When I contested the 2018 Karnataka Assembly elections, I made promises. I lost the election, but did keep my promise of getting youth jobs and getting them employment and education. Also, as a matter of fact, when we speak of Arvind Kejriwal and his promise precisely of paying the respective rent, I urge through this medium, Mera Now, which has been a revolutionary medium on the media front, and I plead the Aam Aadmi Party government. I've been a MLA candidate of the Aam Aadmi Party in the year 2018 here in Karnataka. And let me tell you, the onus and this judgment is not only upon Aam Aadmi Party, but also all the respective parties who do jumlebazi. Like the 15 lakh, Amit Shah ji himself said, "Arey, ye to bas ek jumla tha." I am glad that Justice Pratibha Singh's this landmark observation, a judgment of sorts, will set every politician right, because this could just be an enforceable promise, and inaction will lead to a blasphemy of sorts. So therefore, I believe that be it water, be it electricity, be it road, be it hospitals, the Aam Aadmi Party government and Mr. Arvind Kejriwal will do its best and keep the promise apart. Like my sitting Chief Minister Shri B.S. Yediyurappa ji,
But they
along
haven't.
with
They've
all
forgotten
the
about this.
respective
They
Chief Ministers.
thought this was just a comment that they made at the beginning of the pandemic. There's not even been any movement on it, let alone to say that, oh, okay, we are getting there. This is not an example or case, as far as my understanding is concerned, where it's about bureaucratic hurdles or opposition issues or even the usual, face-off that happens between the Delhi government and the Lieutenant Governor or the centre. But let me
Yes,
just
Tanviji.
come back to the
Quickly
larger
adding
issue
on.
and go back to our legal experts. Mr. Sundaram, to your mind, should we look at this in a legal accountability sense at both the things, government schemes that have been announced but not fulfilled, and promises which are otherwise even verbally made to people and not followed up on?
Look, Tanvi, the point is very simple here. Let me just try to answer your question purely as a lawyer. No emotion involved. No feeling that, oh, how can I be treated like this by a politician who promises X, Y, Z, gets me to give him his vote, my vote, and thereafter lets me down. So let me not go into the emotions of it. Let me go into it purely legally. Yes, the courts have held that any promises made by politicians or parties at the time of seeking election are not legally enforceable. But of course, what will happen is the next time when they make promises for the next election, people aren't going to believe them. And that is the belief that that is what will happen in a democracy. Whether it happens or not is a different matter. But now let us come to this issue of when a party is in power. Please make that difference straight away. One is there is a government which is in power. The other is people are asking for votes. Now, in the second case of people asking for votes, it is not legally enforceable. Unfortunately, it reflects very badly on those people who made the promises, but let's leave it there. In the second case, where a government is in power, if the government follows the policy-making route which is laid down constitutionally and by the rules of business, and you act on that policy, and you alter your position, and this is very important. It's not just a promise. It is that that promise should have been made. You should have believed in that promise. You should have acted on the promise. You should have acted to your detriment by losing something or doing something. You can thereafter tell the government, look here, you cannot withdraw that promise, having made me alter my position, acting on your promise. Now, the dark area is what happens here. The promise has not been made following the rules of business. The promise has not been made following the Constitution. But nonetheless, the promise has been made by a man who you can reasonably believe speaks for the government. And yes, a very diligent person should have checked whether there was a policy of what he said, whether what he said was backed by the rules of business, decision, etc. But equally, a man can say, look here, Mr. Chief Minister, I believe you. I believe you're acting for the government. And I believe in that. And I have altered my position. I have lost this money. Thanks to my acting on your assurance, now make it good to me. Now that leads to a second question. The government can turn around and say, look here, this man went beyond his brief. He was not authorized to make that statement. He went and made that statement which he had no business to make. What then would be the legal position? According to me, if a person has altered his position and can show a court that yes, I've acted legitimately, reasonably, diligently on that promise, he can ask the government to make good what their representative had promised them. Equally, that chief minister must make it good to the government. For having made a promise, he had no authority to make. He had no right to make, and having made that promise. Therefore, I'm saying this is a very, very serious issue, because I hope in future, the ministers, chief ministers will think twice before making such promises and assurances, where someone who's gullible can really act on it. Now, I'm sure that many people, I'm sure my friend Mr. Vasudev Kailash is a big landlord. I'm sure he did not act on that promise, but I'm sure that there were others who did act on that promise. And I think they have a legitimate case to say, look here, why should we not have believed you? Give us one good reason why we should not have believed you and acted on your promise.
Yes, and in fact, the one point that you made, I think is very interesting, and perhaps the first thing that we could look at, Mr. Kailash Vasudev, is when you make promises which you clearly very well know are about things which are not under your control, which don't come under your jurisdiction, which are completely not going to be possible for you to deliver on. At least on those accounts, the government should definitely, be held accountable, legally speaking.
Under the constitutional scheme, a governor or a president must have a chief minister and a cabinet to advise them. The governor or the president cannot function without the aid and advice of a cabinet. Here, the head of the cabinet is the chief minister. He has made a public statement. The public statement is, in view of the terrible situations that you gentlemen are facing, I will support your rent in totality. It is deemed that he is aware of his financial position and the funds available to his state. If he was not aware of it, then he's made a blatantly false statement. A blatantly false statement is punishable under the law. I'm taking it to that effect today. The reason is we are testing the law. The testing of the law is legitimate expectation, promissory estoppel, holding a person liable for the statement he has made. But if it is a false statement, then he has played a fraud. For the purposes of playing a fraud, he is liable to be prosecuted, in my view. It's a different matter whether you can prosecute a chief minister or no. That's another ground to be tested. But I strongly feel there's an opportunity to test the law in its entirety and say we need a change. We've got to look at the whole situation afresh, because these kind of promises lead to a lot of penury. Penury on two sides. A, to the person who doesn't receive the rent as a landlord, who has waived it on the assurance of the government. B, on the part of the tenant, who is supposed to receive the money but can't pay. He's driven down the wall. Let's come to a third situation. Today, all sorts of promises have been held out during this pandemic. We'll give you hospitals, we will give you oxygen, we will give you all facilities. We will provide all sorts of amenities to you. We will give you vaccinations by the end of this year. As of date, none of these promises have been fulfilled. We're looking at the third wave of this pandemic coming up. That's the position which the experts are pointing out. Where is the preparation which has taken place for it? What happens if people die now? For the purposes of this pandemic, you imported thousands of hundreds of oxygen manufacturing machines. Your Air Force was used, your Air India was used, foreign companies and foreign airlines, foreign companies donated generously. We didn't have oxygen. We imported them. We don't have medicines. We're trying to get the vaccinations. So therefore, now we are making assurances that by December, we will have the vaccination. What happens if it doesn't take place? You are now playing with lives. That is where the dangers are.
Tanvi, can I say one thing? Tanvi, can I just say one thing? You know, politicians make hollow
Mr.
promises. Politicians often make hollow promises. These hollow promises, unfortunately, have become a part of political life and has become part of course. Now that, like I said, has to be answered in the elections. But what I'm saying is, now if the government says, I will see all of you are vaccinated by the end of the year, you do not do anything or act to your own detriment or end up spending money or doing something else in the belief and expectation of a promise that you're going to be vaccinated at the end of the year. Therefore, there, strictly speaking, promissory estoppel will not lie. Where it lies is when a government makes a promise and you act to your detriment, acting on that promise, believing in that promise, then the government has to live up to that promise and make good what you have done, acting to your detriment. But hollow promises, unfortunately, where we have not acted to our detriment, like telling me that oxygen will be given, this will be given, that will be given. I don't act based on that promise. And if I don't act in any way based on that promise, all I can say is, look here, I'm going to hold you responsible in the next elections. That's all I unfortunately want to do.
No, Ariyama, I'm going.
So, okay, let me give you one example then. For example, and now it's not just about a promise, it's actually a scheme. When the pandemic hit us, and the frontline warriors and the healthcare workers who are expected to go there, risk their lives, work non-stop, even as we were still discovering, learning about the disease, we were still, making the equipment to protect us from the infection. The government came out with the announcement that they're going to give an insurance cover to these healthcare professionals who fall prey to COVID. But if you look at it right now, a large percentage of them are still waiting for that claim to be paid by the government.
They definitely have a right to demand it. They definitely have a right to demand it. Definitely have a right, because they've acted on that promise.
Ariyama, I'm going one step further. Further because health, good health, continuing with health are a fundamental guarantee by government under the directive principles. You have a right to life. Here, the government is giving you an assurance that, look, by December, we'll make sure that all of you are vaccinated, we'll protect you. If it doesn't happen, your right to life is put at stake. Your right under the directive principles are put at stake. See, this is a typical story of the English parliamentarian who says a politician has three hats. The first hat, he says, is one to cover his head. The second is throw into the ring. And the third is to talk out of. See, so this is where the dangers are arising today. In a system like ours, where we have much to give to our people, we are not giving it for considerations which are based on hearsay or not on evidence. Look at the controversies today. Where don't you have them? Look at the floods. Look at the cutting of forests. Look at the infrastructure. It's a very sad commentary. So what Justice Pratibha Singh is doing now is testing the system and the constitutional norms, which I think is very remarkable on her part.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree with you there.
Absolutely. And in fact, I will actually close on that note as I thank all four of you for joining me. And we're going to be watching out for what Justice Pratibha Singh does next once the government comes and submits its response. But here is how I see it. We have come to a point in our country where many citizens and even those within the constitutional circles, judiciary circles, media circles, have reached a point where you say, okay, now enough is enough. We are done listening to your hollow promises and empty assurances. We don't want to be taken for a ride anymore where we hope and plan and act basis what you promise us, and then you do nothing about it. We understand if you make all the attempt possible, if you try your best, and if you bring in a policy, if you implement it, if you try to solve all the practical problems and push through it, maybe you're not able to deliver 100%, but you tried, and that's all right. But when you don't even try, when you make empty promises inside and outside the parliament, when you make empty promises inside and outside the assemblies, after your cabinet briefings, in your news conferences, and you tell people that I'm going to do something, and so trust me and follow up, and you don't even look back on those promises, then that's a problem. And maybe, just maybe, what has been said today by the Delhi High Court could pave way for larger accountability, legal accountability, and to remind our ministers and chief ministers that you are there to do a job and to fulfill the promises that you made to your voters. Thank you for joining us.